In the autumn of 1944, a young German soldier stepped off a train in southern Oregon, certain that he was about to die. He had survived the deserts of Tunisia, the crowded hold of an American troop ship, and a journey across a continent he had spent his whole life being taught to hate. German radio had warned soldiers for years about what happened to prisoners of the Americans. Slow starvation, forced labor until the body gave out, a bullet in some forgotten forest far from witnesses. Instead, he found green mountains rising against a clear blue sky, orchards heavy with ripening fruit, and guards in the towers who barely seemed to be watching him at all. At his first meal behind the barbed wire of a camp called WWII, a cook handed him a metal tray holding more meat than he had eaten in the previous 2 years combined. Around him, grown men who had marched through the Sahara without flinching sat staring at roast beef and wept. He did not understand why an enemy nation would feed its prisoners better than his own army had fed him in the field. He was about to learn that the answer would change the rest of his life, and that the war he thought he had lost in the sand of North Africa was only the opening skirmish of a much stranger, much longer battle. This one would be fought entirely inside his own mind. Before we dive in, get comfortable and grab your favorite warm drink. Now, check the time. What does your clock say right now? Leave it in the comments, and let's step back into World War II together. Corporal Anton Brandt was 19 years old when he volunteered for the Afrika Korps in the spring of 1941, and 21 when his war ended in the ruins of Tunis. He remembered almost nothing of the actual surrender, only the heat, the silence after the guns stopped, and the strange calm of an officer telling his company to lay down their rifles because further resistance would only add to the dead for no purpose at all. It was May of 1943. Along with more than 200,000 German and Italian soldiers trapped in the collapsing pocket of Tunisia, Brandt walked into captivity with his hands raised and his uniform hanging off a body that had not eaten a full ration in weeks. The months before his capture had been a slow unraveling. Allied aircraft had strangled the supply lines running from Sicily, and the Afrika Korps, once the pride of German propaganda, had been reduced to counting bullets and rationing water. Brandt had learned to sleep through artillery fire, to march for 2 days on a single tin of meat, and to stop asking when resupply would arrive. By the time British and American forces closed the ring around Tunis, some units had gone 3 full days without food. Surrender did not feel like defeat to men in that condition. It felt like the war had simply stopped trying to kill them. What came next unsettled him more than the fighting had. British soldiers marched the prisoners to holding pens along the coast, and within weeks, the Americans took custody of a portion of them, including Brandt, for transport across the Atlantic. He was loaded into the hold of a Liberty ship with hundreds of other men, and for most of the 6-week crossing he was certain the voyage would end with all of them dead in the ocean, quietly, far from any court or newspaper that might ask questions. That was what the political officers back in Africa had promised. The Americans would not bother with camps. It cost money to feed prisoners, and money was something no nation fighting a war could spare on its enemies. Instead, 3 times a day, sailors brought down trays of bread, boiled beef, and vegetables. It was more food than Brandt had eaten in a single day at any point during the previous 2 years of fighting. He ate in silence, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. It never did. When the ship finally reached the American coast and the prisoners were marched onto a train, he found padded seats and clean windows instead of cattle cars. The men around him whispered that this had to be a performance staged for observers, that the real treatment was still coming once they reached wherever they were being taken. Brandt wanted to believe them. It was easier than accepting that everything he had been taught about America might be false. He carried 1 letter from his mother in Stuttgart, already 4 months old by the time it reached him at a processing center in Virginia. She wrote about ration cards, about nights spent in a cellar while bombers passed overhead, about neighbors on their street who had stopped speaking to each other after their sons were killed on the Eastern Front. She did not know where her son was. She would not learn his fate until the Red Cross forwarded a notice weeks later, informing her that Corporal Anton Brandt was a prisoner of war, held in the state of Oregon, and still alive. Brandt read the letter twice a day for the rest of the journey west, trying to reconcile the starving, frightened city his mother described with the calm, well-fed country passing outside his train window. The camp itself sat in a wide valley in southern Oregon, a sprawling installation that had trained thousands of American soldiers earlier in the war, before a portion of it was converted to hold German prisoners. By the time Brandt arrived in the closing months of 1944, more than 1,000 German prisoners occupied a fenced compound on one edge of the post, separated from the rest of the camp by wire and guard towers that, to Brandt's continuing confusion, seemed to be watching for trouble that never came. Beyond the wire, the valley rolled out in every direction, pine forest climbing the slopes toward peaks still holding patches of early snow, a river cutting a silver line through pasture and orchard. Brandt stood for a moment with his duffel bag at his feet and simply looked. The air smelled of cut grass and wood smoke instead of diesel and cordite. Somewhere beyond the fence, a dog barked at nothing in particular, an ordinary, peaceful sound he had not heard in years. It reminded him, in a way that ached somewhere beneath his ribs, of the hills above his grandfather's village in the Black Forest. The summers before the war, when the worst danger in his life was a bad grade in mathematics. He had crossed an ocean as a prisoner and arrived somewhere that looked disturbingly like home. He walked through the main gate a little before noon on a clear September day, one of dozens of new arrivals processed that morning. An American sergeant with a clipboard directed the group toward a row of wooden barracks with tar paper roofs, speaking in short, practical sentences rather than shouted orders. No one struck him. No one pointed a rifle at his back. Inside the barracks, each man was assigned a bunk with an actual mattress, 2 wool blankets, and a pillow. Brandt had spent the better part of 8 months before his capture sleeping directly on sand. He sat on the edge of the bunk and pressed his palm into the mattress, half expecting it to be a trick of some kind, a thin covering over bare boards. It was not. It held his weight and gave gently beneath him, exactly the way a real bed should. Corporal Werner Vogt, captured near the same stretch of Tunisian coastline on the same day as Brandt, took the bunk above him. Vogt was 24, the son of a farming family outside Munich, and had already fought through Poland and France before his unit was transferred south to Africa. He looked around the barracks at the mattresses, the clean floor, the quiet efficiency of the American staff moving between the rows of new prisoners, and said aloud what everyone in the room seemed to be thinking without daring to say it. This cannot be real. That first night, Brandt lay awake long after the lights went out, listening to the unfamiliar quiet. No artillery in the distance, no trucks grinding through the dark, only the wind moving through the pines outside the fence, and the slow breathing of 200 exhausted men finally sleeping on something soft. Somewhere down the row of bunks, a man was crying quietly into his blanket, trying not to be heard, and no one told him to stop. Brandt stared at the underside of Vogt's bunk above him and thought about his father, who had fought in the First War and rarely spoke of it, and wondered whether captivity had ever felt like this for him, whether any generation of German soldiers had ever been handed a mattress and a full stomach by the men who had just finished trying to kill them. At noon, guards walked the new arrivals to the mess hall, and Brandt smelled cooking food before he reached the door. Not the thin broth that had passed for rations during the final year of the North African campaign, and not the hard bread that crumbled to dust before it reached the mouth. Actual meat, roasting. The prisoners formed a line, and American cooks filled metal trays divided into sections: roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, a slice of bread with butter, a cup of coffee. Brandt carried his tray to a long wooden table and sat down among men who, one by one, stopped moving and simply stared at what had been placed in front of them. He looked at the portion of meat on his own tray and understood, with a kind of quiet disbelief, that it was more than he had eaten in any single meal since before his transfer to Africa. He thought of the broken supply convoys, the days without resupply, the officers who had learned to divide a single tin of rations among 4 men and call it dinner. Vogt leaned across the table and murmured that the Americans were fattening them up before the killing began, that no army fed its enemies like this without a reason. Brandt picked up his fork anyway. "If they intend to shoot us," he said, "then I will die on a full stomach." He ate everything on the tray, and by the time he finished, he noticed that other men around the room had begun eating too. Some of them were crying quietly as they did it. Brandt did not cry, but he sat afterward turning the tray over in his hands, trying and failing to make sense of what he had just witnessed. That afternoon, an American officer addressed the new arrivals in careful, deliberate German, laying out the terms under which they would live for the remainder of the war. Prisoners would work most days of the week and receive modest pay for their labor, spendable at a camp canteen for cigarettes, soap, and writing paper. Letters home would travel through the Red Cross, though delivery across the Atlantic in wartime conditions could take months. Recreation time, a camp library, and evening classes in English would be available to any prisoner who wanted them. Rations, the officer said, would match those given to American soldiers, and medical treatment would be identical as well, in accordance with the terms of the Geneva Convention that governed how prisoners of war were to be treated by both sides. Brandt raised his hand and asked, in German, whether any of it was real. The officer studied him for a moment before answering. "This is a prisoner of war camp," he said. "You will be treated as the Geneva Convention requires. You will work, you will be paid for it, and you will be fed properly. When the war ends, you will go home. That is what is real here, nothing more and nothing less." Vogt muttered under his breath that the Americans were trying to make them soft, to strip away whatever discipline remained in them before shipping them back to a defeated Germany. Brandt said nothing in reply. He was still thinking about the roast beef, and about a truth he was not yet ready to say out loud, that nothing in his training, his propaganda, or his 3 years at war had prepared him for a country that treated its enemies this way. The routine at the camp settled into something Brandt could never have imagined while he was still fighting in the desert. 6 days a week, trucks carried groups of prisoners out into the valley to work the farms that had lost their sons and hired hands to the war. Oregon needed labor, and the government had decided that German prisoners, fed and housed at the expense of the army, could fill part of that gap. Brandt's group was assigned most often to a pear orchard a short drive from the camp, owned by a man named Karl Reinhold, a second-generation German-American who spoke the language of his prisoners more fluently than most of the guards who escorted them. On the first morning at Reinhold's orchard, Brandt expected a line of armed men watching their every move. Instead, a single guard rode along in the truck, and once the group reached the rows of trees, he settled beneath a shade tree with a newspaper and did not move again for hours. Reinhold walked the prisoners through the orchard himself, showing them how to twist a pear from its stem without bruising the flesh, how to judge ripeness by color and firmness, how to fill the wooden crates without wasting a single fruit. A good worker, he told them in German, could fill more than 30 crates in a day. Meet the quota, and the truck would take you back to camp early. Fall behind and you stayed until the work was finished. Brandt worked carefully that first day, turning each pear in his palm before setting it down, and by mid-morning he realized something that unsettled him more than the unarmed guard had. Nobody was standing over his shoulder. Nobody was checking whether he sabotaged the crop out of spite, whether he simply walked away into the tree line and vanished. When he finally asked Vogt, working 2 rows over, where the rest of the guards were, Vogt only shrugged and kept picking. It was Reinhold who answered, later, when he returned at midday with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. "Where would you go?" Reinhold asked, setting down the sandwiches and studying Brandt with an expression that was not unkind, when Brandt finally put the question to him directly. "You have no money, no civilian clothes, no map, and every farmer and shopkeeper for 50 miles knows German prisoners work these orchards. Walk into the nearest town and someone calls the sheriff before you finish your first cup of coffee. Much easier to pick pears, earn a little money, eat good food, and wait for the war to end. Then you go home. Vogt, sitting nearby with a sandwich in his hand, asked quietly what happened if a man did not want to go home. Reinhold considered the question longer than Brandt expected. "Then you come back here after the war," he said finally, "and I will have work for you. You already know how to pick pears." The sandwiches that day were ham and cheese, and Brandt ate his slowly, trying to remember the last time a midday meal had not felt like an emergency ration doled out between marches. Reinhold sat with the prisoners while they ate, asking questions in German about where they were from, what their families did, whether they had wives or sweethearts waiting for them. Brandt told him about Stuttgart, about his father's small print shop, about being pulled out of an apprenticeship at 19 to train for a war that had, in the space of 2 years, taken him from the streets of a quiet German city to the sand of the Sahara, and now to an orchard in the Pacific Northwest that could have been transplanted whole from the hills above his childhood home. By late afternoon, Brandt had filled well past his quota, driven partly by the strange, restless energy of a body no longer starving, and partly by something he did not examine too closely, a need to prove to himself that he could still be useful, still be good at something, even as a prisoner. When the truck arrived to collect the work crew, Reinhold pressed a few extra coins into his hand without a word and told him only to buy something at the canteen that reminded him of home. The work rotated through the harvest season, pears giving way to apples, then to potatoes and onions as autumn deepened into winter. Some mornings the valley filled with fog so thick the pine ridges vanished entirely, and the prisoners worked half-blind until the sun burned it away by mid-morning, the wet earth releasing a smell that reminded Brandt of autumns before the war, walking home from school through streets lined with linden trees. Other days brought a hard, cold rain that soaked through wool uniforms within the hour, and the men worked anyway, because a full quota still meant an early truck back to camp and a hot meal waiting. The labor was hard, long hours bent over rows of vegetables in cold, wet fields, but it bore no resemblance to the war. No one was trying to kill him. No one was rationing his food to nothing. At the end of each day there was a hot meal waiting, and increasingly there was something else Brandt had not expected to find in an enemy country, a kind of ordinary human company. Reinhold's wife began sending pies to the camp after a day the crew had worked especially hard, and the guards distributed slices among the men who had earned them. Brandt ate his slowly enough to make it last, the sweetness of it almost unbearable after years of hunger. In the evenings, when the work was finished and the men had eaten, the camp offered something else that unsettled Brandt even more than the food. Classes, taught by an American lieutenant who had studied in Berlin before the war and spoke German without a trace of an accent. At first the classes covered simple, practical English, phrases a man might need to buy bread or ask directions. But as autumn wore into winter, the lessons expanded into something the Americans called information sessions, though every prisoner in the room understood exactly what it really was. Films about the American Constitution, explanations of how elections worked, how citizens could vote out a leader they disliked without fear of arrest, how newspapers published articles openly criticizing the government, and nothing happened to the men who wrote them. Brandt did not believe any of it at first. In the Germany he had grown up in, a single sentence against the wrong official could end with a visit from the police in the middle of the night. The lieutenant seemed to expect this skepticism. One evening he brought several different American newspapers into the barracks and spread them across a table, showing the prisoners how one paper praised a policy that another paper condemned in the same week, both printed freely, both sold openly on the same street corner. Later, he arranged for local Oregon residents, farmers and shopkeepers from towns near the camp, to speak to the prisoners directly. Some of them said they had voted for President Roosevelt in the last election. Others said they had voted against him and planned to do so again. All of them stood in front of German prisoners and said these things without lowering their voices, without looking over their shoulders, and then simply went home afterward to their ordinary lives. Brandt sat through these sessions in silence, turning the information over in his mind the way he had once turned a pear in his palm, checking it for flaws, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. It never did. One evening, the lieutenant asked the room a question that stayed with Brandt far longer than any of the films or newspapers had. If a soldier in your unit had openly criticized a general and been proven right a year later, what would have happened to him? No one answered aloud, though every man in the room already knew, because every man in the room had watched it happen at least once. Brandt thought of a sergeant in his own company in Africa who had questioned a supply order 2 years earlier, quietly and only to his own officers, and who had been transferred to a punishment battalion within the month. He said nothing about it in the classroom, but he carried the comparison back to his bunk that night and turned it over for a long time before he slept. Vogt attended the same sessions and grew angrier with each one, arguing afterward in the barracks that this was simply a more sophisticated form of the same trick, an attempt to hollow out whatever remained of German discipline and pride before sending them home as broken, compliant men. Brandt no longer had a ready answer for him. He had begun, quietly and without admitting it even to himself, to wonder whether Vogt's anger was less about the Americans and more about what accepting the truth of what he was seeing would cost him. In January of 1945, new prisoners arrived at the camp, men captured during the desperate German offensive through the Ardennes forest the previous month. They were different from the North Africa veterans who had arrived earlier. Harder men, many of them younger, some barely out of school, and far more committed to the ideology that had sent them to war in the first place. They did not believe the stories the older prisoners told them about good food and easy treatment, certain it was some kind of trap or performance staged for their arrival. Their first meal in the mess hall provoked exactly the reaction the food had provoked in Brandt months earlier, except with more open hostility. One of the new arrivals stood up in the middle of the meal and hurled his tray against the wall, shouting that eating enemy food while comrades were still dying on the Rhine was a betrayal, that a true German soldier would rather starve. Guards escorted him out. By the next morning he was back in the fields with everyone else, picking through frozen ground for the last of the onion crop, and he said nothing more about starvation. The new arrivals brought tension into the camp that had not existed before, a hard undercurrent running beneath the daily routine of work and meals. Some of the younger, more fanatical prisoners began watching the older men closely, noting who attended the English classes too eagerly, who spoke too warmly of the farmers they worked for, who seemed, in their eyes, to be forgetting what side of the war he belonged to. Whispered accusations circulated in the barracks after lights out. In other prisoner of war camps across the country that winter, this kind of internal pressure among hardline prisoners against those judged insufficiently loyal had occasionally turned violent, a pattern the camp's American staff were aware of and watched for carefully. At Brandt's camp it never crossed that line, but it came close enough that men who had grown comfortable speaking openly about the strangeness of their situation began choosing their words more carefully in front of the newer arrivals. Brandt kept working, kept attending the evening classes, and kept writing to his mother every week, though her replies arrived erratically and always weeks or months out of date by the time they reached him. Through the winter, the letters grew harder to read. Stuttgart, she wrote, was being bombed with increasing frequency, entire blocks reduced to rubble in a single night. Food was scarce even with ration cards. Neighbors who had once been strangers now shared what little they had, because the alternative was watching each other starve. She asked after his health, told him not to worry about her, and signed each letter the same way she always had, as though nothing about their lives had changed since he left for training in 1941. Brandt read these letters sitting on his bunk after the evening meal, the taste of roast beef or apple pie still faint in his mouth, and felt something twist in his chest that he did not have a word for. Once, he read a passage twice before he understood it. His mother had written that the family cat, a gray tabby he had raised from a kitten before the war, had finally been lost during a night raid in January, not killed by the bombing itself, but simply gone missing afterward. One small, ordinary loss, folded into a letter otherwise full of larger ones. It was such a small detail, and it broke something loose in him that the descriptions of collapsed buildings had not quite managed to reach. It was not quite guilt, though it resembled guilt. It was the specific, disorienting pain of eating well while people he loved went hungry in a city he had once called home, of sleeping on a real mattress while his mother slept in a cellar listening for bombers. He wrote back careful, short letters. He was safe. He was working on farms in a beautiful part of the country. The Americans treated prisoners fairly, exactly as the Geneva Convention required. He did not write about the roast beef, or the pie, or Reinhold's offer of work after the war, because he did not know how to explain those things to a woman living through nightly air raids, without the words sounding like a cruelty he did not intend. By February, even the hardest of the new arrivals had largely stopped complaining about the food, though the ideological tension in the barracks never fully disappeared. A handful of the Ardennes prisoners began attending the evening English classes as well, first quietly, then more openly, until the divide between the old prisoners and the new ones softened into something closer to a shared, unspoken exhaustion. The war news reaching the camp through newspapers and radio broadcasts left less and less room for denial. Soviet forces were advancing through Poland toward the German border. American and British armies had crossed the Rhine. Berlin itself was being bombed nearly every day. Brandt read the reports in halting English, checking his understanding against the German translations posted in the camp library, and thought each time of his mother in her cellar in Stuttgart, 4,000 miles away and utterly unreachable. In March, Reinhold invited Brandt and 3 other prisoners to help him pour a concrete foundation for a new equipment garage on his property, work that fell outside the usual rhythm of picking and hauling. It was slower, more deliberate labor, mixing cement, setting forms, checking each pour for level before it hardened. Reinhold worked alongside them rather than simply directing from a distance, and one afternoon he brought his wife out to meet the crew. She arrived with a basket of fresh bread and a jar of plum jam, and the men sat together in the unfinished garage eating bread with jam and drinking coffee, while she asked, in careful German, about their families and their lives before the war. Brandt told her about the print shop, about his father, about the apprenticeship he had left unfinished. She listened and refilled his cup twice without being asked, and when the men finally returned to work, she sent them back with the rest of the bread wrapped in cloth napkins. "Keep the napkins," she told Brandt when he tried to hand his back. "I have plenty at home." It was such a small kindness, and it struck him harder than almost anything else that had happened since his capture. Nobody in his life since 1941 had given him something simply because they wanted him to have it, with no larger purpose behind the gesture. The garage took nearly 3 weeks to finish. When the last of the concrete had cured, Reinhold walked through the structure with Brandt, running a hand along the smooth walls, nodding with something like pride. "This will last 50 years, he said, tapping the wall once with the flat of his hand, as though confirming a fact rather than making a boast. Then he handed Brandt an envelope, extra pay for the extra work, more money than Brandt had earned in 6 weeks of ordinary labor combined. Brandt tried to refuse it. Reinhold refused the refusal. "I would pay an American worker this much for the same job," he said. "You earned it. Keep it." That evening at the camp canteen, Brandt spent part of the money on a magazine about American automobile manufacturing, drawn in by photographs of assembly lines producing vehicles by the thousands every month. An ocean of steel and rubber and gasoline that no wartime shortage seemed to touch. He thought of the Africa Corps in its final months. Tanks abandoned by the roadside for lack of fuel, trucks cannibalized for parts because replacements never arrived. Staring at the photographs of American factories, he understood, in a way that felt almost physical, precisely why Germany had lost the war in North Africa and was now losing it everywhere else. It was not a failure of courage, it was a failure of everything that came before courage, the factories and the fuel and the ships that kept an army fed and armed long after its enemy's supply lines had collapsed. The end came on the 8th of May, 1945. Loudspeakers across the camp crackled to life in the middle of the morning, calling every prisoner to the main yard. The camp commander read a short statement in English, and a translator repeated it in German for the assembled men. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was finished. Adolf Hitler was dead. The Third Reich, the government that had sent nearly every man standing in that yard to war, no longer existed. Brandt stood in the crowd and listened to the translation without moving. Around him, more than 1,000 German soldiers absorbed the end of everything they had fought for in complete silence. No one wept, no one shouted in protest, no one fell to his knees. The American staff, who had reportedly braced for some kind of emotional collapse among the prisoners, found instead a yard full of quiet, exhausted men who, after a moment, simply turned and walked back toward their barracks when the guards dismissed them. That night, Vogt sat on his bunk staring at the wall for a long time before he spoke. "We lost," he said finally, his voice flat and very quiet in the darkened barracks. Brandt agreed that they had. "Everything," Vogt said. "My father died in Poland in 1940. My brother died in Russia 2 years later. For nothing." Brandt had no answer for him. He thought about Stuttgart, about his mother whose last letter had described a night of bombing so heavy the ground shook blocks away from where the bombs actually fell, about the print shop that was almost certainly gone, about the life he had left behind in 1941 that no longer existed in any form he would recognize. He thought too, though he did not say it aloud, about the Green Mountains beyond the wire, about Reinhold's offer of work, about the concrete garage that would stand for 50 years whether Germany rebuilt itself or not. "I do not know if I want to go back," Vogt said quietly into the dark. Brandt understood the feeling exactly, because he had been carrying the same thought for months without ever putting it into words. The problem, both men knew without saying it, was that wanting to stay changed nothing. American law did not permit enemy soldiers to remain in the country once the war ended, whatever offers a sympathetic farmer might make. Germany needed every able body it could get back within its borders to begin the long work of rebuilding, and the occupying powers, intent on remaking the country as a democracy, considered men who had spent a year listening to lectures on the Constitution and watching free elections explained by ordinary Oregon farmers to be exactly the kind of citizens the new Germany would need. Whether Brandt wanted to stay in Oregon was, in the end, entirely beside the point. Orders were orders, and the orders, when they finally came, would send him home. The prisoners remained at the camp through the summer and fall of 1945, long after the guns in Europe had gone silent. Oregon still needed hands in its fields, and American servicemen were still being demobilized from the Pacific, where the war against Japan had only ended in August. So the German prisoners kept picking pears and apples, kept pulling potatoes and onions from the wet valley soil, working a harvest for a war that, for them, was already finished. Brandt spent most of those months back at Reinhold's orchard, and by autumn Reinhold had begun requesting him by name whenever a crew was assigned. The first departures began in December. Groups of 100 men at a time loaded onto trains bound for the coast, then onto ships that would carry them back across an ocean most of them had crossed only once before, as frightened prisoners certain they were headed toward execution. Brandt's orders came on a Friday in the middle of the month. Report to the main gate before dawn in 4 days, with whatever belongings he could carry. Reinhold drove to the camp the day before Brandt's departure and asked the guards for permission to speak with him. They met across a wire mesh divider in a small visitor's room, an arrangement that struck Brandt as almost absurd after 2 years of working the man's orchard with no fence between them at all. Reinhold pushed an envelope through a gap in the mesh. "Money," he said, "for when you reach Germany." Enough to start again. Brandt tried to refuse it, the way he had tried to refuse the extra pay for the garage months earlier, and Reinhold refused the refusal just as firmly. "You worked hard," he said. "You earned it, and you will need it more than I do." Inside the envelope, Brandt later found more money than he had earned across his entire time at the camp. Reinhold spoke once more before the visit ended, his voice quieter than usual. "If you find your way back to Oregon after things settle," he said, "there is work for you here. I know people in Portland who understand the immigration laws. It can be done, when the time is right." Brandt nodded, unable to trust his own voice enough to answer. Reinhold studied him for a moment longer, then said only, "Take care of your mother," and left. The truck carrying Brandt and the last group of prisoners pulled away from the camp before sunrise the next morning. He looked back once at the compound as it receded. The barracks, the mess hall, the library, the American flag already catching the first gray light over the main gate. Vogt sat beside him in the truck bed, quiet for most of the ride, until he finally asked whether Reinhold had made him the same offer. Brandt admitted that he had. So had Vogt's own farmer, a wheat grower north of the valley who Vogt had worked for through most of the previous year. Neither man said what both of them were thinking, that whatever the offer meant, whatever it promised, orders were orders, and the ship to Europe was already waiting. Brandt reached Stuttgart in January of 1946, and the city that greeted him was worse than even his mother's letters had prepared him for. Entire streets he remembered from childhood no longer existed as streets at all, just corridors of rubble, with paths worn through them by the thousands of people still living in basements and half-collapsed buildings because there was nowhere else to go. Food distributed under the occupation authorities fell well short of what the population needed, and the black market, illegal and unavoidable, kept much of the city alive in ways the official ration books could not. He found his mother in 3 rooms of a building that had lost its upper 2 floors to a bombing raid the previous spring. She did not recognize him at first, standing in the doorway in a coat 2 sizes too large, and then she did, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. His father had died in March of 1945, killed when the munitions factory where he had been conscripted to work was hit during a raid, 2 months before the war in Europe ended. His mother had written none of this in her letters, unwilling or unable to put it into words that might reach him. Brandt gave her the money from Reinhold that same week. She cried when she understood what it was and what it could buy on the black market, enough to keep them both fed for months. He found work soon after, at a small printing company, attempting to restart operations amid the ruins of the city's industry. Work that drew directly on the apprenticeship he had abandoned 5 years earlier to volunteer for a war he barely remembered wanting. The pay was modest, mostly occupation currency and the promise of food when supplies allowed, but it was work, and work was more than most men in Stuttgart that winter could find. Slowly, unevenly, the city began to rebuild itself around him. The American and British occupation authorities pushed for a new constitution, new political parties, elections that would eventually put power back in German hands under a government designed, deliberately, to prevent the concentration of authority that had produced the Third Reich. Brandt attended some of the public meetings where these plans were explained to ordinary citizens and found the explanations oddly familiar, the same concepts he had first encountered sitting on a bunk in an Oregon barracks listening to an American lieutenant describe how a free press worked. He did not say this out loud to anyone. It seemed like a strange thing to admit, that he had learned what his own country was trying to become by watching it demonstrated, imperfectly and informally, inside a prisoner of war camp on the other side of the world. By 1948, the man who had hired him at the printing company had died and left the small business to Brandt in recognition of the work he had put into keeping it running through the worst of the shortages. Brandt married a woman from Stuttgart the following year, a nurse who had spent the war treating the wounded in an overcrowded city hospital, and they had 2 daughters within a few years of each other. A life took shape, ordinary and hard-won, built out of the wreckage of a city that had once seemed permanently beyond repair. He never forgot Oregon. He kept Reinhold's letters in a drawer in his small apartment, rereading them occasionally, and in the summer of 1952, another letter arrived, unprompted, in Reinhold's familiar handwriting. "The offer still stands," it read. "If you want to come, I will help arrange it. The immigration rules have changed enough now that it may be possible for men who worked the farms during the war. Bring your family if you decide to come." Brandt showed the letter to his wife that evening. She read it twice before asking what he wanted to do. He admitted that he did not know. Germany was better than it had been. Their life in Stuttgart was stable, even comfortable by the standards of the previous decade. But Oregon, he told her, had felt like something more than a place. She listened to him describe it again: the mountains, the orchards, the strange, unearned kindness of people who owed him nothing and gave him food and money and friendship anyway. "Go and see it for yourself," she said finally. "If it is what you remember, we will decide together." Brandt traveled alone to Oregon in the summer of 1953. Reinhold met him at the airport in Portland and drove him south through the same valley Brandt remembered from the back of a truck nearly a decade earlier. The mountains looked exactly as he remembered them. The orchard had grown larger. The concrete garage still stood, solid and unremarkable after 8 years of use, exactly as Reinhold had promised it would. Brandt spent 2 weeks working the harvest again, and this time there was no fence, no guard tower, no truck waiting to carry him back to a compound at the end of the day. He could walk into town if he wanted. He could go anywhere in the country he could afford to reach. After a childhood under one dictatorship and years of occupation under the cautious rebuilding of a new democracy, the plainness of that freedom struck him harder than almost anything else about the visit. Before he left, Reinhold made the offer formal: work for him for 2 years, and then he would sell Brandt a parcel of orchard land at a fair price, enough to start a business of his own. Brandt returned to Stuttgart and discussed it with his wife, and by the autumn they had made their decision. They sold what they had, booked passage to America, and arrived in Oregon in February of 1954 with 2 young daughters who spoke no English, and within a year spoke almost nothing else. Brandt worked the orchard for 3 years before he judged himself ready, and in 1957 he bought 30 acres of pear trees of his own, built a house, and began the slow work of establishing a business that would outlast him. His daughters grew up as ordinary Oregon children, attended local schools, and in time raised families of their own who knew their grandfather's history only as a story told carefully, in pieces, over many years. In 1961, Brandt stood in a courthouse in Medford and swore an oath of citizenship. The judge who administered it had served in France during the war, and afterward, shaking Brandt's hand, said simply that a man who returned to build a life in the country that had once held him prisoner had already answered any question about where he belonged. Brandt lived out the rest of his life in that valley. He never described the camp he had once feared as heaven. Not really. Not in the way his younger self had thought it on that first bewildered afternoon over a tray of roast beef. Heaven had nothing to do with mattresses or apple pie. What he had found in Oregon was something more ordinary and, in its way, more remarkable. A country willing to feed and shelter an enemy according to its own stated principles, even when cruelty would have cost it nothing. He spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that decision, not through gratitude alone, but through the plain, patient work of building something that lasted, in the same soil where he had once arrived expecting to be shot.